Hey Swamp Dweller, my family has had an insane number of experiences with the supernatural. We are a family of women with psychic abilities and men that have had just some crazy, unexplainable occurrences. Today, I wanted to share a story with you and your followers. Something that did not happen to me, but to my uncle. He doesn't use the internet a whole lot and didn't even know how to get his story out there. So, I'm submitting it on his behalf. Without further ado, this story takes place in Canada, specifically the outskirts of Thunder Bay, in the year of 2003. My uncle has always been what most would call a drifter. He was seldom in one spot for too long and would get around by hitchhiking. Christmas of 2002 leading into January 2003, my uncle had traveled from Regina to Ontario to spend the holidays with our family. We were all located in Ontario at the time. As the holiday seasons had passed, he made his way back to Regina in his most common fashion, hitchhiking. He had an uneventful trip until he made it to Thunder Bay. He was dropped off by a transport trucker on a desolate highway outside of Thunder Bay, as that was as far as the trucker could take him. He had wandered further and further down the highway with rarely any passing vehicles, none willing to stop and give him a ride. It was between 2 and 3 a.m. at this point, and he was absolutely freezing. It started to slow his pace and take many breaks along his walk. He ended up standing in one spot for some time in an attempt to warm himself and conserve energy. It was under a street light, and his spot was well lit. Suddenly, he began to hear what sounded like branches snapping behind him in the tree line, about a half a football field length away. He chalked it up to a deer or a moose, as the deep Canadian forest is full of wildlife that are quite active at night. He then heard what sounded like a groaning sound, muffled and almost sounding like a human, but not quite. He decided to continue walking and would speed his pace up in between streetlights because he just had this eerie feeling. Something was off, and he felt this pit in his stomach, like something was eating away at him. He could hear whatever it was in the tree line following him as he moved. It seemed to mimic him almost, but it seemed to remain in the tree line. Branches cracked, and in between cracks he could hear grunts and groans. Then it hit him. The grotesque smell of raw meat that had been baking in the sun mixed with what smelled like garbage. He could see a moving figure that appeared to be white in color with patchy fur. He had never been so afraid in his life, with no way to call for help and the isolating feeling brought on by the realization that not a single vehicle had passed in hours. He felt helpless and feared for his life, quite frankly. He tried to keep moving, faster and faster. The creature kept this pace, yet still remained in the tree line, just out of sight, almost as if it was playing with him. He stopped as he approached the final streetlight on the stretch of highway, and felt the most fear he has ever felt in his life. Streetlight's dim light was the only sense of safety he was able to grasp, and now it was gone. He turned to face the tree line and noticed that he couldn't see or hear anything, and he had thought the creature had given up on him. He almost sighed a breath of relief, and he heard a branch snap once more, almost directly in front of him. What came next has stuck with him, a shriek so loud and shrill that it made his entire body freeze up, rendering him in a state of shock paralysis. Thankfully, headlights approached and came to a halt beside him. He hadn't even the capacity to turn and try to catch a ride. He was still paralyzed with fear. It was a lovely man in a large black Jeep. The gentleman screamed to my uncle to get in the vehicle, and he did not protest and jumped right in. Naturally, not his first instinct, as he prefers to get a feel for the person stopping to pick him up. But the man had a tone of urgency and fear, and my uncle did not want to be a meal for whatever that creature was. As soon as my uncle jumped into the Jeep, the man sped off and then parked about 20 minutes up the road and explained to my uncle what he had saw when he was approaching him on the highway. My uncle was so grateful that the man had seen what he did. Based upon the description, my uncle's in-depth research of cryptids following this experience, we all believe what my uncle saw was probably a Wendigo, or something of that nature. Montana must be one of the most beautiful places in the world, and it is one of the last beautiful places in the United States that still truly feels wild. Unlike my native California, where almost every area of natural beauty is plastered with man-made trails, ranger stations, and tourist traps. But I do not mean to offend anyone. I'm sure your favorite hiking spots in Wisconsin or Washington or wherever are amazing. And maybe it is just a little internal bias talking, having watched too many old cowboy movies with my dad. But, to me, Montana truly feels like one of the last, untouched wilderness areas in North America. And luckily, a buddy of mine feels the same way about it. So every year around September, he and I would take a trip up to Bozeman to spend some time away from big city life out here in San Francisco. We had been friends forever and pretty much spent all of our high school and college days together. But since we slammed into our 30s and did all the boring grown-up stuff like getting married, having kids, focusing on careers, we do not really nearly have enough time to spend together. So I honestly relish our year trip to Montana together, where we can catch up on stuff, get some serious drinking in, but most importantly, indulge a mutual hobby of ours that has verged on an obsession ever since we were teenagers. Hunting. Our stomping ground of choice has always been Glacier National Park, right up on the Canadian border. It is about a 5-hour drive from Bozeman itself, but we make a point of driving out for a few days. One to get settled into a campsite, another few to hunt, all before a few days of drinking back in Bozeman to celebrate our successes or commiserate our failures. So last year, we repeated the same old ritual, driving out to the national park with our hunting gear in tow. We found a good place to park up, hiked a few hours into the wilderness, and found a decent little spot to set up camp. Every year, we seem to be a little more exhausted when the day ends. Call it a little bit of a side effect of getting older, I guess. So last year we passed out earlier than normal in our one-man tents, with the intention of rising at dawn to begin our day's hunt. 6 a.m. the next morning, the little alarm on my wristwatch starts beeping. It is the closest thing that is similar to the feeling of Christmas morning when you are a kid. It is just pure excitement. Jumping out of bed to see what hunting Santa has left among the trees for us that day. We have a little breakfast, drink a little coffee, and then pack up and head out. For those of you that are unfamiliar with hunting or nature in general, there are 2 times in a day when birds sing the loudest: dawn and dusk. It sounds all pretty to us humans, like this wonderful lyrical bird song. But it's just pure war cries. What sounds sweet and cute to us is them being like, I am here, and if you come up in my tree, I'll mess you up, so back the F up, other birds. And it is something that soundtracks every morning hunt. Every single time we have visited Glacier Park. But that morning, it was almost silent. We could hear the odd squawk in the distance, but our immediate vicinity was silent as the grave. And that only means one thing, that a large predator is in the area. Something that is on the hunt. I remember the look on my buddy's face when he turned to me and stated the exact thing. How I double-checked that I had a can of bear mace on me, just in case anything happened. But that area up Montana, right near the Canadian border, is known to have wolf packs roaming around. And I shuddered at the thought of what would happen if we were cornered by one. 2 aging city boys would be run down in an instant. We would not stand a chance. We would be torn apart and eaten alive right there in the forest floor. Probably before we could even get a shot off. Trigger discipline is probably the most important aspect of firearm safety, but I struggled to keep my finger off the trigger of my Remington once I had racked around into the chamber. The fear was palpable. It felt like something was close, real close, and in the woods as dense as the ones we were in, something could be on top of us in just seconds. Then, after another mile or so of walking through the near-silent forest, we saw it in the distance, a grizzly, and it was freaking huge. I had never seen one in the flesh before that day, and I was completely overwhelmed by the size of that damn thing. I mean, they were monsters, in the very sense of the word. Just a damn flesh tank. A ball of muscle and sinew, perfectly designed to chase down, kill, and shred whatever they want. We watched it staring back at us. It had this dull expression on its face before it sniffed the air a little bit, catching our scent. We must have looked like frightened little boys. But to the grizzly, we were nothing. This was just another day. And we were just another meal, another kill, business as usual. We just slowly walked on, keeping our eyes on that murder machine the whole time. until it was eventually out of sight. We are not dumb. We knew we could not just hang around and carry on our hunt with that thing in the area. Especially not since it had our scent. So, slowly, but surely, we made our way back to camp, with the intention of packing up and moving to a safer area. But God laughs at well-laid plans, and about halfway back, as we were keeping our heads on a swivel, trying to keep an eye out for that thing stalking us through the trees, I heard something heavy, and it was bounding straight toward us. I could not see it right away, and frankly, the idea that something so huge could just creep up on us like that is something that is just pure nightmare fuel to me. But stalk us it did, and in a moment of pure stomach-churning horror, it knocked my buddy to the ground as easy as a grown man might knock over a child. I mean, it just sent him crashing into the dirt. And it was on him within seconds. How I managed to miss that thing's head with my first shot is something I will never really understand. I'm an experienced hunter, and I'm a rather good marksman, but pure panic took over. Crippling fear just had me turning to jelly. The feeling of expecting to see my best friend in the world torn apart before me is something I am never, ever going to forget. I am not military. I have never had any official training, nothing like that. So, I did not even think to work the bolt action and chamber another round. I just went for the bear mace, spraying it right in the eyes of that thing as it slashed his claws across my buddy's chest and face, tearing up clothing and flesh, with deep, gouging strikes. His screams, though, that is what I kept hearing in the quieter moments during the months following that trip. These blood-curdling screams as he thought he was going to die, and not just die, be eaten alive, watching his own guts being torn from his body and chewed up right there in front of him. But it worked. Somehow the bear mace just worked, and immediately stopped clawing at my buddy, started wrinkling its nose, and doing these weird like sneezes or coughs. I cannot really think of any way to describe it, but what was obvious is that it was in considerable discomfort, as the ingredients in the mace went to work on its nose and eyes. Then as suddenly as it appeared, it took off again, crashing through the trees, smacking into the odd tree here and there. It obviously struggled to see where it was going. Then it was just a case of checking on my buddy. But Jesus Christ, he was an absolute mess. The bear's claws had torn off chunks of flesh from his face, shoulders and chest, and blood was everywhere. And I mean everywhere. I was frantic too. I kept alternating between trying to tend to his wounds and looking around to make sure the bear was not charging us again. When I think back to it, I can only see certain frames. It's not like a movie in my head. It's just like still pictures, very patchy. A side effect of the adrenaline, I guess. The blood is leaking off my buddy as I help him to his feet. He could run, but the attack had stunned him, and he was shook very violently as I pulled him up and started dragging him back in the direction of our campsite. Any of the bear mace and bear spray or whatever you want to call it had worked, but for how long I had no idea. So we ran as fast as our legs would carry us through the trees and over hillocks, until we saw the bright orange fabric of one of our man tents. Another weird memory I have is of my buddy applying his own gauze bandages. You like to think the guy would be in major pain, but he was just running on pure adrenaline. That bear tore him up bad, but he could not feel a thing. It was just pure survival instinct kicking in. He was a survivor, and he was not about to go down easy, and in a twisted kind of way, and I was proud of him. By that point, my one major concern was that he would lose too much blood on the way back to our truck. I mean, he had already left a blood trail from the scene of the attack, so the bear would be able to trace our path really easily if it wanted to. So I was stuck in a horrendous catch-22 situation. Leave him with his rifle and risk getting attacked again, or have him come with me and help, risking him bleed to death or leading the bear onto our trail. But a primal angry roar that echoed through the trees kind of made that decision for us. The bear was still in the area. Not even that, it was close, and it was angry. I wrapped half my buddy's head like a gauze, taped a buttload of whatever I had to his chest so it would stop bleeding, and we got to running again. Almost every step we took, I expected that bear just to appear again. Only this time, if it attacked me, my buddy would not have a rifle to be able to take that thing out. Although the fact the bear mace had worked was a huge comfort, so there was no doubt that it would work a second time. But we got lucky for a second time that day. The first time when the injuries to my buddy were not as bad as they could have been. And the second time when that bear did not rally for a second attack. We made it out of the park and down to a place called Ennis quickly. We visited a medical clinic, got my buddy all stitched up and patched, then actually headed to the bar to just decompress and unwind from the nightmare that we had just lived through. My buddy did not have to buy a single beer that night, not as he told the story of getting full-on attacked by a fully grown grizzly bear. We are not sure if we are going to go on our trip this September. All this COVID stuff aside, I'm not sure either one of us is quite ready to go back to that horse. But I look forward to the day that we are. I am not going to let a horrific encounter like that ruin the one thing that kept us close for so many years. I have a couple of stories to share here, all of them involving my family's cabin in a small town in Wyoming. So, for starters, I need to put this into context. I was born and raised in South Dakota, and if you ever look at a map of it, you will see that it's a great beige rectangle with a singular circle of green right on the west side of the state. That is where I grew up. Now, the west side of South Dakota has some amazing sights, and it makes up for there being pretty much nothing to do here. But nothing here holds a candle to the cabin. The cabin is exactly what it sounds like. A log cabin with no running water, a well, and a creek adjacent. The only modern part about it is that it has electricity, and that was added in the 1930s. It is an hour away from my hometown, and if you die up there, there is no chance you will ever be found. So, it is my favorite place to go. It was great, and when I was stressed from high school and such, and I wanted to get away, it was exactly where I would go. And now that I am 25, it is still my favorite place to unwind after a long week. But it has its quirks. I'm going to start with the most normal of stories. Not normal because this stuff happens all the time, but because there was no paranormal, extraterrestrial, or ooga booga stuff that I could really lay on for an explanation. I was 13 years old at my sister's birthday party. My sister and I always celebrate our birthdays up there. My dad had to leave to take my sister's friend who cannot sleep over back to their home. My mom does not like to spend the night up there, so she left before sun went down. This left 13-year-old me with about 5, 10 to 11-year-old girls. In short, I was miserable. I was poking at the fire, planning on dropping some scary stories on them, so that they would have nightmares when I heard a distinct rustling noise coming from the dry creek just ahead of us. I looked up from the fire and saw a figure approaching us. I told my sister to quietly get back to the cabin. She looked at me and was about to say, "Why?" when she saw that my eyes were fixed on some sort of singular point. She followed my gaze, and not long after she saw the old bearded man, wide-eyed, and stumbling toward us. She screamed, prompting her friends to scream, and they all ran back to the cabin. The screaming stunned me, as I was sure that this man would now proceed to kill me after he was done marching to the cabin, and then would finish off the girls. But that did not happen. Instead, he stopped and just started mumbling some incoherent nonsense. I could only make out a few words, something about deer, rope, and crick, and some sort of razor blade. Eventually, I gathered up the courage to tell him off. I let him know there were guns in the cabin, and if he did not leave, I would go get one. After I said this, I began to walk towards the cabin and eventually retreated inside of it. We told my dad when he got back what happened, and he wasted no time gathering up people from the surrounding community. The old guy was caught, but not by the police. He was caught by his daughter, who thanked my dad. I was not there for that part. This guy was just an incredibly old man with dementia who wandered out of his cabin and followed the road to ours, thinking it was one of the cutoffs to the creek. As for the razor blades, well, back in the 1970s, a group of rednecks got tired of city people swimming in their creek. So, one of the rope swings they attached had razor blades on it. A bunch of kids got their hands cut up, and the rednecks were never caught, and all they managed to do was get basically every rope swing cut down and banned from the area. I feel sadder than scared when I remember this. However, this is only the first story I have up there. Now, before I go any further, I need you to realize that this place was located on a mountain. It was very remote, as I explained earlier, but definitely had something living on the land. When I was a teenager, I used to hang out there with my friends all the time. We'll call them P and S, just for anonymity's sake. So, one day, we were just sitting outside and talking about all the weird stuff that has happened out here, and this road that we were on. We were just taking a walk and trying to enjoy ourselves. It just goes straight up into the woods from here. And as we were sitting there just talking, all of us got the worst feeling of dread. This was not normal. It felt like I was being washed from all sides. Just to let you know, we were still close enough to where I lived to be able to see the motion lights and everything else. That's when we noticed out of nowhere, the motion lights had turned on. At first, we thought it might just be one of the animals that live around here. Obviously, there are dogs that roam and such like that. Or maybe it was just one of my family members going outside for a second. So, we decided to make our way back to the house. As we're making our way there, though, my friend stops me and tells me that they see something around on the corner of the house. At first, I think they're just seeing stuff because it is kind of dark out. But then, we hear a blood-curdling screech and some sort of garbled noise. It almost sounds like something is trying to yell something, but it also just sounds so inhuman. And then, that's when we noticed a deer. It was standing there, looking at us, with these whited-out eyes. They looked clouded, is the best way I can describe it. This thing was absolutely massive, though. It looked distorted. It looked wrong. It was just like all the stories I've heard on the channel in the past. It was at that very moment I knew I was either looking at a skinwalker or a not deer. Now, the first thing I did was hold my breath and get ready to tell my friends to run as fast as they could to the front door. We were on a mountain far away from the next town, and there was nothing that could come save us if this thing got angry and decided we were its next meal. So we began sprinting towards the door, and it looks like this thing is beelining to cut us off. But strangely, as we are about to intersect and almost run into this thing, it suddenly turns and runs the opposite way, but on two legs, and is suddenly yelling something that I can't quite make out and decipher, but it sounds like a distorted radio, like when you hear a radio just malfunctioning incredibly going through station from station. That's what this thing sounded like. We could hear it bounding through the forest, going up higher into the mountain. I don't know what we experienced that night, but I'm just glad that we got our way with our lives. I know for sure, though, that what we encountered must have been a skinwalker, and I have since dubbed that area Skinwalker Mountain. I've taken my yearly journey to the woods to hunt since I was 14. Last year started just like every other one before had, but it would end much earlier and in a very different way than usual. Despite the weather being too warm for hunting, I was at dawn and on opening day like always. As the season drags on, the deer get more skittish. So, starting as early as you can will increase your chances. On the lease I'd been hunting on for the past 7 years, I had a small handful of preferred spots, and this is where I was heading. This spot was a tree stand setting roughly 30 feet high in an old oak that looked out across one of our 3 feed plots. I'd had good luck there more than once and hoped to have it again. With a drive out there to the stand took about probably 15 minutes or so from my cabin, so I left an hour before dawn. I wanted to be on the stand just as the first bit of light broke. As usual, I parked my four-wheeler about 50 yards away and walked the rest of the way in. Not sure if it makes any real difference, but not making a bunch of noise right next to where I'd be hunting seems like a wise idea. So it's a practice I try to remember to do each time I hunt. Although I'd been up for over an hour and had a couple of cups of coffee, I was still a little bit groggy. I've never been a morning type of guy, and once I retired, I've gotten up when I woke up, no certain time. So, I slung my rifle onto my back and began the climb. About 3 steps from the top, with the seat in sight, one of my feet slipped from the ladder, then I fell about 25 feet onto my back. Somehow, my rifle ended up next to me rather than under. There was no pain at first, so I figured I'd just get up and dust myself off. However, I discovered very quickly that at least one, if not both, my legs were broken. As I sat up to examine my legs, the pain began shooting throughout my back and body. It appeared then that in addition to broken legs, I had incurred a major back injury. My usual high pain tolerance was letting me down, and the adrenaline was beginning to wear off. I knew in a matter of minutes I was going to be screaming in pain. I began feeling for my phone, and soon found in my chest pocket. Luckily, I didn't land on my chest. Right. Being out in the middle of nowhere didn't necessarily mean there wouldn't be any cell service. In my neck of the woods, cell towers are more common than trees. I dialed 911 and waited, but the call dropped off. The pain was making me very nauseous, and I was having a hard time concentrating. It took me a moment to realize I was going to need to move if I had any chance of getting help. I couldn't think of any other way, so I gritted my teeth and rolled over onto my stomach. The pain very nearly caused me to pass out. But the stars soon passed, and I began pulling myself forward with my arms. I'd made it around 15 yards before I was forced to take a break. Once I'd pulled myself together, I tried to call 911 again, but it was a no-go. I looked around and noticed I was still under the trees, but there was a clearing not far away. I gritted my teeth again and pulled myself forward. I had to take a couple of breaks, but eventually, I was in the open. I crossed my fingers and pressed send. The wait was agonizing, but it finally began ringing, and I was connected to a dispatcher. The pain made the wait for help seem even longer. But, because of my location and clear directions, they made it to me within 30 minutes. As I laid there, I watched the sunrise, thinking how beautiful a scene it was. I only wished it was under better circumstances. By the time I was released from the hospital a few days later, I would have had 2 broken legs, a broken back, which really amounts to 3 smashed vertebrae, and a mild concussion. The legs would have had to have healed with time, but with my back, I've had a couple of those vertebrae fused. That surgery was done just a few months before this year's hunting season, and you can be sure I was there, waiting for the sun to rise on the first morning. One thing has changed, however. For the time being, I'll be hunting from a blind on the ground. There's no way I'm going to go another year with an empty freezer, you know. This is one of the scariest experiences I have ever had. My 80-year-old grandpa who walks with a cane has COPD and very bad knees that I will refer to as Papa, and I were white-tailed deer hunting in the hills of Oklahoma. We had a spot right off the side of a mountain where we could walk off the side and find 2 separate trees to sit beside. Now, we had hunted the spot many times in the past and always saw something. The morning of that fateful day was foggy. We couldn't really see 10 feet in front of you. We got out at a spot right at daylight and were loading our guns. I only have a single-shot .223, and he has a lever-action .30-30. As I'm leaning over and drinking the last of my hot chocolate on the truck, something caught the corner of my eye. I could see something's feet slowly walk across the road we were parked on. Now, all I can see is 4 things moving across the ground and nothing above. It honestly looks similar to frog feet. I let Papa know by pointing it out, of course, but he can't see it. So we go ahead and walk in the woods, and the woods are deathly quiet for the rest of the morning. We go back to the camp and wait until about 3 so we can go back to our spot. Once we're back in our places by the trees, the woods are still deathly quiet. No birds, no bugs, nothing. Then I see it about 100 yards in front of us. Something flicking its tail. The tail flicking, I know, could be a cat. A big cat. This thing could move like a bat out of hell. Let me tell you that the moment I saw this thing is seemingly new and took off to our side like a rocket. I knew it was stalking us. I get it moving slow and got to my papa. I told him what was going on, and he gets serious and tells me we have to go and get up. He takes the front, then I walk backward and sideways up the hill. While he was there sitting for a few times, because, like I said, his bad knees, we had to take multiple breaks. I see the cat every time, but he's always at a different spot. We finally made it back to the truck and got out of there. We didn't go back to that spot for another year or so,